Okay, I think I'm live. I'm actually live almost an hour earlier than I expected to be because by my reckoning it was 7 p.m. UK time that we started, but it turns out that it's 6 p.m. UK time that we're due to start. And I know that we've got like a time lag on this, so I just have to kind of go ahead in good faith that you guys are going to catch up with me in a minute or two and still be there. Um, So I'm just going to start. And the first thing I need to do is find the button that lets me screen share, which I'm going to do now. And we go into an infinite regress until I do that and bring up my title slide. Okay, so thanks everybody for tuning in. I say everybody, that could be 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 people. I don't know. I don't know where you are or who you are, which makes it a kind of weird presentation, but I'm just going to talk through a few slides about a book project that I'm currently working on. The book's called Pervasive Punishment. Um, the subtitle at the moment is Making Sense of Mass Supervision. Obviously, the presentation has a slightly different subtitle because I'm going to focus just on one aspect of the analysis in the second half of tonight's remarks. But I'll talk you through the project overall and give you a sense of where the argument is going before I focus specifically on the theme of experiencing and representing mass supervision. You can see on the first slide that there's a blog, a Pervasive Punishment blog, which I'm using to kind of track the progress of the book's development and to share some of the resources and materials that relate to it as a work in progress. And I'm hoping that's kind of interesting, not just as a way of rehearsing the content and arguments of the book, but also occasionally to reflect on the process of writing, which I think is something that as academics maybe we don't do enough. So there's a few posts in there already which are more process related. I'll try to keep on offering some of those thoughts as I go along. Okay. So in the abstract, I said that I would share work in progress from the book. In a slide or two, I'll tell you how much progress I've made and what remains to be written. But I know already that I'm going to focus on the third part of the book's analysis, which concerns the penal character of mass supervision as a lived experience. And some of you might already have come across a paper published a couple of months ago, at least in the online advanced access versions of Punishment and Society, which is called Mass Supervision, Misrecognition and the Malopticon. And I'm going to draw on that paper, but also extend and develop and refine the analysis of it a little bit further in the second half of the talk. Methodologically, that paper and the chapter that I'm going to talk about is, I guess, a little bit innovative or at least different in that it uses pictures taken by and songs written with people under supervision in Scotland or with previous experience of supervision in Scotland to represent and explore the meaning and impact of supervision. And I hope that, well, I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the reason or some of the reasons behind using pictures and songs, which are both directly research related and also related to what I hope to do with this book in the public sphere as a contribution to both a counter-visual criminology and a public criminology. I have to say, for legal reasons, that the copyright in the pictures used in this presentation rests with their authors. I'm licensed to use the images, but if you want to use them, please just get in touch with me and I can organize permissions for you, I'm sure. Okay, there's a third creative strand to the book, which comes in the form of a short story. I've decided to include in each chapter of the book, and there are 7 chapters, an extract of a short story which evolves alongside the more conventional academic analysis. And I'll say a bit more in a moment about why I'm doing this and why I'm using pictures and songs. But I'm going to start the talk just by reading the very first of these extracts, which is the book's opening sequence. So this is a piece of fiction, the beginning of a piece of fiction, but it's based on lots of research and practice experience over the last 30 odd years. And it draws also on data from the supervisable and seen and heard projects that I'll be talking about later. So this is called An Invisible Collar. Joe sat on the bench in the waiting room. Looking down, he noticed that the bench was screwed to the floor. Not even the furniture here was free. Perspex screens and locked doors separated him and the others waiting from those for whom they waited. The veil between the untrustworthy and those to whom they were entrusted. Joe absent-mindedly read the graffiti carved into the bench, testimonies of resistance that made the place feel even more desperate. He scanned the postered walls, shouting their messages in pastel shades and bold print. Problems with drugs, problems with alcohol, problems with anger. Stay calm. Apparently help is at hand, or at the end of a phone line. But meanwhile, remember that abusive language and aggressive behaviour will not be tolerated. Not in this room that itself felt like an installation of abuse and aggression. To Joe, it said, "You're pathetic, desperate, or dangerous. You are not to be trusted. You must wait." He fidgeted and returned his eyes to the floor, downcast by the weight of the room's assault, avoiding contact, avoiding hassle, staying as unknown as possible in this shame pit. Better to be out of place here than to belong. This was no place to make connections. Joe wondered what she would be like. Pauline, the unknown woman who now held the keys to his freedom. Her word had become his law. This was an order, after all. He was to be the rule keeper, she the ruler, cruel, capricious, or kind. She might hold the leash tightly, or she might drag him to heel. Instinctively, he lifted his hand to his neck, but no one can loosen an invisible collar. At least it was not a noose. Joe swallowed uncomfortably, noticing the dryness of his mouth and the churning in his gut. He was not condemned to hang. He was condemned to be left hanging. Joe wondered what Pauline would be like. So, in the story, in the pictures, and in the songs, I am trying consciously to provide cultural representations, forms of media that bring to life an invisible punishment. I'm certainly not the first person to describe probation and parole and supervisory sanctions, as I call them in the round, to describe them as invisible punishments. And Gwen Robinson has a wonderful paper in Punishment and Society a couple of years ago, referring to the Cinderella complex, meaning that supervision and the study of supervision in the punishment and society field has been like Cinderella, very late to the ball, the punishment and society ball, not able to compete in the scholarly imagination, far less in the public imagination, with mass incarceration or with the death penalty. So a neglected, underanalyzed aspect of penalty. And she attributes this to three factors: problems of definition, language, and labeling. It's hard to describe what we mean when we talk about supervision, community sanctions and measures, to use the European jargon. These things are called by different names. They have different legal forms. They are constituted, constructed, and delivered differently, even when called the same thing, or they're called different things and delivered in similar ways in different places and at different times. But what I mean broadly by speaking about supervision is probation, parole, and other community sanctions, principally what we would call community service or unpaid work. I don't mean jail or prison. I know that in some of the American literature and sometimes in conversation with North Americans, when we talk about mass supervision, people wrap all of corrections into that phrase, including custodial measures, prisons and jails. But I don't mean to include those. I mean mass supervision to stand alongside and in some kind of symbiotic relationship with mass incarceration, but to refer to sanctions that take place in the community, not within the walls of a prison or a jail. So that's my swift and inaccurate or no doubt unsatisfying or incomplete response to the problem of definition. The second problem is the invisibility of the field, and Gwen is writing principally about the academic sphere when she talks about that invisibility, and she's analysing the neglect of the topic in punishment and society scholarship. But I'm concerned also about the implications of the invisibility of supervision in the public sphere. I'll give you a concrete example of this, which I use in the introductory chapter of the book. So last September in England, a young woman, I think she's 23 years old, called Lavinia Woodward, was sentenced to something called a suspended sentence order. That's a community sanction in the English context, one where the court defines a period of imprisonment that would be served, but suspends the custodial sentence so long as the person complies with community-based supervision. And the conditions of the community-based supervision can come in multiple forms. Everything from submission to electronic monitoring, to drug or alcohol treatment, to bans from certain places or association with certain people. Certain kinds of conduct can be required. Residence in particular places can be required. There's a whole plethora of possibilities for how such an order might be constituted. However, when Lavinia Woodward received her suspended sentence order, the press seized upon that disposal for a couple of reasons. One was that she'd committed a violent crime. She had stabbed a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend in the leg while intoxicated. Another reason was that she was a privileged young woman, a student at the University of Oxford who was pursuing high-level studies, who came from a privileged middle-class background and was clearly heading for a very well-paid career. A third reason was that the judge focused on her exceptional potential and talents in determining that she was not the sort of person who would or should normally go to prison. So there were legitimate debates about the justice of her sentence. But what concerned me most was that media reporting of her sentence described her as having walked free from court, having escaped a jail sentence. Both clauses of that description are factually inaccurate. She didn't escape a jail sentence. She received a jail sentence, one which was conditionally suspended, and she didn't walk free from court. She walked away from court under supervision. However, the meaningfulness of those two things, conditionality, suspension, the third thing, supervision, is at best unclear and at worst completely opaque to the public. So if you imagine yourself imagining now in this moment trying to guess what it means to Lavinia Woodward to be the subject of a suspended sentence order, I wonder what picture you conjure in your mind. What is it that you might be able to see her doing? Where do you think she might be? Do you think she's experiencing the suspended sentence order as punishment or as help? Is it burdensome or a relief? It's difficult to populate our imaginations. If we knew that she'd gone to prison, we would already be imagining, well, it's dinner time here in Glasgow, so I would be imagining the dining hall scene. If it was a different time of the day, I might be imagining her in a classroom. or in an industrial unit doing some work. Or I might be imagining her in a cell, passing time, or in a gym, taking exercise, or in a yard. And there's a certain architecture that would define my imaginings of her experience of imprisonment, but no equivalent architecture for my imaginings of what it is for her to be subject to this suspended sentence order. And of course, the lack of capacity to imagine what this sentence means leaves us woefully ill-equipped to even debate its justice or appropriateness. Um, and also leaves us in a position where we might doubt the legitimacy of the institution through which that sentence is delivered, which in England would be either the National Probation Service or what's called a private sector community rehabilitation company, depending on the level of assessed risk. So that's why I think this invisibility is a big problem. And it's linked to the third problem that Gwen identifies, which is whether or not supervision is, in fact, penal, whether it's a punishment. And of course, that question about the debatable nature of the penal character of supervision has a long history dating back to the inception of probation, at least in England and Wales, also in Scotland, I think also in America, where it was instead of punishment that a person was placed on probation. And although the law may have changed in that respect, uh, public perceptions and even, I would argue, judicial perceptions have lagged far behind. And I want to talk about the penal character of supervision shortly. But first, a kind of summary of where I'm going with the book as a whole. So the concept of mass supervision has been sort of bubbling up and evolving over the last few years. It's associated with the work of the Cost Action on Offender Supervision in Europe, which I was privileged to chair between 2012 and 2016, working with European scholars from 23 countries and hosting visits from some excellent North American colleagues, including Michelle Phelps, Josh Page, and Ruben Miller, all came to speak to that network at different times. And we were a network of about 70 academics, probably about 35 of them highly active, in networking to try to figure out how to study supervision and how to study it in comparative context. And early in the development of our work, we came across Michelle Phelps' work on mass probation and on mass penal control, saw the symmetries and synergies between the analyses that were evolving on both sides of the Atlantic, and we've been talking ever since. So when I talk about mass supervision, and this is me rather than the network, I think about scale. Obviously, the word mass evokes questions of size and scale. But as soon as we begin to think about scale, we're compelled to ask comparative questions about, compared to which other jurisdiction are we experiencing mass supervision? Compared to what period in our own history are we experiencing mass supervision? Compared to what other alternative sanction, like imprisonment, are we experiencing mass supervision? So there's some kind of immediate need to decide what the metric is for mass supervision, and that's a question that I struggle with in chapter 3 of the book. Chapter 3 also looks at the distribution of mass supervision. The book's title, Pervasive Punishment, speaks to the way that supervision has spread through society, and also to the way that qualitatively it pervades the life of those subject to it. But there's something slightly misleading about the term pervasive, in the sense that supervision is also concentrated in certain segments of the population, and it's socio-spatially concentrated. According to Michelle's work in the States, summarizing rather crudely, it's not quite as concentrated in terms, for example, of racialization as incarceration is, but it's certainly far from evenly distributed across the population, as you would expect. And so in chapter 3, I look at does get supervision and who doesn't get supervision. I look at issues to do with revocation and its unevenness. And I look at the socio-spatial location of supervised populations. My original contribution in that chapter is by analysing Scottish administrative data, but the chapter also includes a significant engagement with Michelle's work on the USA. That's a bit like comparing, let me think of a Scottish example. No, that won't mean anything to you. Well, let's just put it this way. Scotland is, in population terms and in terms of geographical scale, about the size of South Carolina. So to compare a small Western European state with the USA is obviously problematic, but there are actually several quite interesting points of comparison and scale between one jurisdiction in Scotland and 50 jurisdictions in the USA. There's some interesting things that come out of that, which I'll come on to in a moment. I'm going to talk more about intensification and the impacts or effects of mass supervision, because the mass here is not quantitative, it refers rather to the felt consequences or the subjective experience of being treated as one of many. So there's still an element of quantification involved, but this is more to do with the phenomenology of mass supervision, if you like, and what it is to be individualized, to use Deleuze's term, or to be treated as one of many, or merely as one of a kind. Not one of a kind as in unique, but one of a type, rather. There's some literature in the UK and probably elsewhere about community warehousing, the equivalent of the warehouse prison, and about probation overcrowding. And as I say, I want to explore this as a lived experience, both for individuals and for collectives. And the third strand of mass supervision for me, or the third set of interesting questions, is about the legitimation and adaptation of supervision. How is it that the welfare sanction probation survived the cold climate of the culture of control and the icy chill of the new punitiveness, and instead of contracting and withering, expanded and flourished during late modernity? So what happened that enabled probation to grow so rapidly during a period which in some respects looks to be structurally and culturally constituted in a way which is antithetical to probation's original ethos? What happened to let that happen, both at the level of the institutional history of probation and at the level of the reshaping of the associated socio-penal practices? So when it comes, I'm doing this in the wrong order, so I'm going to go forward. All right. So this is the shape of the book. These are the current versions of the chapter titles. So there's a short introduction called Punishment Pervades, which introduces the ways in which I'm using the term pervasive and lays out the basics of my own conceptualization of mass supervision. There's a second chapter which is a kind of intended as a sort of theoretical conceptual toolkit, which draws on a range of different ways of thinking about how punishment changes, from the classics, if you like, of Marx, Foucault, and Durkheim. Got my chronology wrong there, but it doesn't matter. Through to all the debates about late modern penal transformations, Garland, Leconte, and others, and right up to the book on which I'll lean actually at different parts of the book, which is Goodman, Page, and Phelps' work on breaking the pendulum. So I'm looking there to kind of provide myself and readers of the book with conceptual resources to make sense of what follows. Chapter 3 does the numbers, looks at scale and distribution. Chapter 4 tells the story of legitimation and adaptation, zeroing in particularly on the Scottish case. Chapter 5 is the one I'm going to speak about in a moment, focusing on the experience of mass supervision. Chapter 6, which is half written, takes a different turn. The last two chapters move into quite different territory. They are no longer trying to analyse mass supervision. They are asking questions about what we can do about it. And the first of those, chapter 6, is concerned with ways of opening up constructive public, political, democratic dialogue and deliberation about mass supervision as a social issue. And the second is prescriptive. That's my contribution to that dialogue, giving my view on what we could or should do about what I see as a social problem. So that's the shape of the book. And yeah, 5 of them are drafted, 1 is half drafted, and 1 is merely imagined. So if I go back to chapter 2 and to the model that sort of feeds through my attempts to explain mass supervision, from the classics, I suppose I take the analysis of what are called here distal influences on penal change. So broadly, the social, the structural, cultural, political dynamics that create and constrain penal possibilities. And I used, I think, Garland's term conjunctural to suggest that any account of penal change needs to be all of these things, structural, cultural, and political. But then, again, following several others, including Garland himself, I go on to argue that that's not enough to understand these wider social forces and then to look at how they play out in penality requires an examination of more proximate influences on penal systems. And this is where concepts of the penal state or the carceral state begin to have their play. I take those to refer to specific configurations of constitutional, political, institutional, organizational, professional, and civic forms and dynamics that somehow conspire to, again, create and constrain penal possibilities. Local influences, and this is problematic, that's not the right word, but I haven't found the right word yet. But one thing that I noticed in Michelle Phelps' analysis, and one thing that becomes clear when you dig deeper into the example of a small nation like Scotland, is that even a state level or a jurisdiction level analysis focused on all of those forms and dynamics mentioned under proximate influences is not quite enough. The field needs to be analysed also in terms of the dispositions or habitus of different penal actors, the distributions of material and cultural resources among and between them, their social networks and social capital, recognition and distinction in the field, and how that determines influence, symbolic power, if you like. And of course, at the local level, it's easiest to see how happenstance, how events shape penal possibilities. So in the Scottish context, when I was a social worker, for example, we had the first major public scandal about a supervision failure that was associated with the death of a child. And I can still tell you that the boy's name was Scott Simpson, that he was 7, that he was killed by a man called Stephen Leask, who was recently released from prison under a supervised release order, and that the social worker in that case lost their job and their reputation as a result of an inquiry. And I can tell you that the minister responsible in Scotland took Scotland's probation managers into a room at a conference in the wake of that case and said, if you can assure me that your staff have followed every iota of the national standards that govern the way that this business is to be practiced, then I'll give you my backing in these circumstances. If I find any failure in your practice, I'll hang you out to dry. That's not a direct quote, it's a paraphrase that I have on good authority from somebody who was in the room. The shiver that went through my workplace and the professional or occupational group to which I belonged at the time still resonates with me. We knew then that we were in the business of public protection and risk management, and that if we didn't get that right, in inverted commas, we could expect consequences to follow. And that was a very significant moment in the history of the Scottish supervisory field, for want of a better expression. It's not a case that would have made much of an impact internationally, even in the UK context, and there have been many cases like it subsequently. But it affected the dispositions of actors. It created and set in chain certain path dependencies, and the way in which key actors responded to it with some sort of exercise of human agency had profound effects that are still felt, I think, in the Scottish field. So to borrow from Goodman, Page and Phelps, their brilliant book speaks about the importance of contestation, the agonistic quality of the struggle over penality and penal change. Another aspect of their analysis, if I'm remembering it correctly, is that the distal to the proximate to the local is not a one-directional set of influences. So it's not that the social shapes the state and the state shapes the field and the field shapes the practice. These are affective and affecting relationships. So sometimes the local affects the proximate, sometimes the state is reconfigured as a result of what happens locally. A good example is probation itself as a penal innovation, which was in Scotland, in England, and I think in North America, a local innovation in the first instance, driven by practitioners creating a new form of response to a problem that they faced in their courts. And it was that idea that was seeded at the local level and then spread. I'm sure I've read something of Ashley's that speaks to that kind of process as well, although I can't think of the concrete example at the moment in my head. So I see these not as linear related in some sort of hierarchy of influence, but rather as interwoven, mutually constitutive and so on. And I also add to Goodman, Page and Phelps's notion of contestation, legitimation, the importance of legitimation, which obviously invokes Weber, but also earlier work that Gwen and Shad Maruna and I did together on how probation survived late modernity. Okay, so that's the kind of general stuff. Here's a quick summary of where I get to before I get on to the kind of nitty gritty of the part of the book that concerns experiencing supervision. So I'm arguing that we need to change or clarify the punishment and society explanandum. And again, I just invoke and agree with Michelle Phelps here that we need to study not just how much we punish, but also how penal control is exercised. Michelle is speaking in that paper about the need to look at not just whether a given state in America is a high imprisonment or low imprisonment rate state, but also to look at the probation rate in the state. And some states are high in both imprisonment and probation, some are low in both, some are high in one and low in the other. And when we have a more refined analysis of what kind of state a state is, what configuration of custodial and community sanctions it deploys, then things are complicated in an interesting and useful way. So to study the evolution of the relationship between punishment and society, or to study the way in which the penal state is configured and reconfigured, has to entail an analysis of how supervision moves and develops. And I think a preoccupation with imprisonment is actually very problematic. And the over-reliance on imprisonment as the sort of quintessential case of the punishment that needs to be accounted for is a problem for our field. Okay, so if we can agree that it's important to study supervision, then We need to account for its dispersal, for its pervasiveness in late modernity, but we also, paradoxically, need to account for its concentration. Because although it's much more pervasive than it once was, it's also quite intensely concentrated, even if, as I said before, not quite as intensely concentrated as imprisonment. So, what's driving that? Fourth point, we need to understand the contingent relationships between the contestation, legitimation, and instantiation of penalty, analysing these processes and their impact all the way down. So, for me, contestation is not just in the leadership of the penal state and in its governance, but all the way down into the way that practice is constituted, and therefore right down into the way that the experience of a sanction is constructed. So I'll come back to that point later. We need to explore how penal control is experienced, the very local, and that's as local as it gets, the way that I suffer my penalty or the way that I benefit from the second chance. Those very localized experiences shed light on the proximate and even the distal influences. Penal change occurs bottom up as well as top down. I'm repeating myself, so I'll move on. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to chapter 5 of the book, which is called, at the moment, Experiencing Mass Supervision, and I'm going to take you back to the short story and read you a little bit more. This is episode 5, so you've missed 3, but it can stand alone. Pauline, that's Joe's social worker or probation officer, she wondered if she'd earned the right to ask the next question, and then she plowed ahead. Look, Joe, let me be honest with you. I can understand why you were so pissed off with your boss. He sounds like a total dick. And I can see that the red paint made a point about him bleeding you dry over the years. I'm not saying it was justified, but I get it. But to be blunt, pissing on the reception room floor? What was that all about? I know, Joe replied, head in hands and eyes fixed on the bare floorboards below. I'm totally mortified about that. I did send Tracy some flowers by way of apology. She's the office cleaner. She's a lovely woman. I hate the thought of her having to mop that up. Joe took a deep breath, lifted his head, looked Pauline in the eye, and continued, Look, the simple fact was that I drank 5 or 6 beers, winding myself up for the confrontation. Confrontation really is not my thing, nor is beer, but in the heat of the moment and finding myself with a bladder fit to burst, spraying piss around like Michael Douglas in that movie Wall Street just seemed like a great way to mess with Steve's massive ego. Needless to say, it didn't look so clever on the CCTV the police showed me, but then none of it did. Pauline smiled and shook her head. Yeah, pretty moronic, eh? Any chance of a refill? While Joe reboiled the kettle, Pauline studied their surroundings. Joe's place was not, she imagined, a deliberate effort at Scandinavian minimalism taken to extremes. More likely, it revealed that lack of self-care that often accompanies depression. The living room in his one-bedroom apartment boasted only a large beanbag, an easy chair, bottom of the range IKEA, and a small coffee table. An old TV sat on the floor in the corner. The uncurtained window looked out over the courtyard of what was a converted 1920s fire station. A gated community sealed off from the city life outside. She'd seen much worse places, but she couldn't imagine Joe's kids being keen on sleepovers unless they shared their dad's newfound aesthetic tastes. Joe placed a fresh cup of instant coffee in front of Pauline and resumed his place awkwardly on the beanbag, sitting cross-legged and trying not to feel like an errant child. Anyway, Pauline continued, enough about what happened. Let's talk about now, and let's talk about the future. We've got 17 months of this order to get through, and you have the tag, that's the device that electronically monitors the wearer's compliance with curfew. You have the tag and your 7/7 curfew for the next 5 months. I suppose there are really just 2 or 3 questions. How do we get you through this without any further bother, and what do you want out of it? What do you want your future to be? Joe felt blindsided by the last 2 questions. The future? What future? He hadn't really been able to think clearly since the wheels came off the car. It wasn't just that he wasn't driving the car, it was that he hadn't stopped falling since his life crashed. There didn't seem to be any solid ground from which to take a view, just a constant tumble of words and images. Was Pauline really going to help him find some solid ground? The first question is a lot easier to answer than the other two. I'm fine with the tag. I haven't really had much of a social life since the divorce. It turned out that most of the friendships that we'd kept up since we married were really my ex-wife's friends. I have a couple of old pals, but we don't see that much of each other. On football match or night in the pub, at least before all this happened. I'm totally off the drink for now and not missing it. I have the TV and the radio. Joe took a sip of his tea, looked out the window, and continued. To be honest, the days are harder than the nights. Work was such a habit that I can't get used to the sheer emptiness of the days. I miss the action and the sense of purpose much more than the money, though my ex and the kids might take a different view about that. I'm looking for work, but it's not easy at my age, and it's also pretty tricky explaining to your potential future boss why you assaulted your former boss. On the two occasions when I got as far as interviews, I've seen the colour drain from their faces at that point. Work isn't the only possible kind of action and purpose, though, is it? Pauline interjected. No, I guess not. I still want to be a proper dad, but it's harder than that amounts to a trip to the movies and a KFC family bucket once a week. Pauline could feel herself sinking into Joe's hopelessness. The emptiness and the desolation of the flat wasn't helping, nor was the sense of being locked in. But it was giving her the germ of an idea. Look, Joe, you're an experienced accountant with a hell of a lot of skills and resources. You're not broke. You still have some redundancy money, even after paying for the office cleanup. You said it yourself, you need some action and some purpose. You need to break out of this cell. A smile crept across her face, and Joe raised an eyebrow in trepidation or curiosity. And I have an idea about how we might spring you. So, on that cliffhanger, you have to read episode 6 to find out what that idea is. Let's have a think then about experiencing mass supervision. Now, there's lots of ways of studying this, both in North America and in Europe. There's been a fair amount of survey and interview-based research. My friend and colleague Jan Jarnescu and colleagues linked to the cost action recently published a paper on something called the Eurobarometer on experiencing supervision, which has these domains exploring through survey methods how supervision is experienced in general, how the supervisor is perceived, how the relationship is perceived, how the management of compliance, breach, revocation is perceived, how people, how and in what ways, if any, they regard supervision as rehabilitative, and to what extent they feel involved in their own supervision. And the one sort of headline message from that paper, which was only based on a small pilot study really to develop the tool, so it's not representative or generalizable. But it's interesting that across the several European jurisdictions involved, people agreed or stated that supervision was both punitive and rehabilitative, albeit more punitive than rehabilitative. And the interview research that looks at this in a slightly deeper way in different jurisdictions seems to reach a similar conclusion, at least that the experience of being supervised is highly contingent on the quality of relationships that constitute the experience. So, and I've argued this before and won't labour the point, but prison has an architecture. Prison is mediated by relationships, relationships with other imprisoned people, relationships with staff, relationships with the outside world. All of those affect qualitatively the experience of being imprisoned, but imprisonment is nonetheless defined by confinement to a large extent. Probation, parole, and supervision are only constituted in and mediated by the relationships. There is no architecture. So it's kind of obvious that the qualities of the relationships, particularly between supervisor and supervised, are going to have a profound effect. Ethnographies of supervision in recent years have shed much greater light on not just on the experience of supervision. I've listed these here. They're not all, strictly speaking, ethnographies of supervision. Alexandra Cox's work is much broader. Reuben Miller's work is on re-entry. Lacombe is looking at programs in a custodial context. So it's not strictly speaking supervision in my sense, although I include it because Leon Degarde's work follows up on how people convicted of sexual offences experience their post-release supervision, and there's a nice synergy between the two papers and studies. All of these shed great light on what it is to be supervised, and interestingly, they all, I think, highlight painful aspects, difficult aspects of being supervised, and they tend to highlight those difficulties more clearly than in interview-based studies. And I think there are methodological problems with interview-based studies, which we could talk about later. I haven't got time to go into these studies, although I do briefly review them both in the Punishment Society paper and in the book. In many ways, I'm using them to draw out an analysis of supervision in the community, which is in some ways a bit like Ben Crew's analysis of the exercise of soft power in prisons, his work on the depth, weight, and tightness of penal regimes. But let's go on and give you some of the data or evidence from the two studies that I want to briefly discuss. So Supervisible was another pilot project of the cost action that worked across Germany, England, and Scotland. There's a paper co-authored with Wendy Fitzgibbon and Christine Graves, which is in the recently published Routledge International Handbook of Visual Criminology, which gives the kind of overall story across the three jurisdictions. But here I just want to focus on Scotland. So this is using photo elicitation and photo voice methodologies, working with just 10 people, 7 men, 3 women, wide range of age, diverse forms of supervision, recruited in 2 different ways. One group through a local criminal justice social work team, one group through social media contacts and an advocacy organisation that I work with. In each context, we gave people a briefing, we being me and a photographer and artist, Jenny Wicks. We sent them off with disposable cameras, asking them to take pictures that represented their experience of being supervised and how they felt about it. We brought them back, we put the photographs in to be developed, we ate lunch together, then we got the photos back and had focus group discussions. So we generated about 160 images in Scotland and about 2 hours of discussion, audio recorded and analysed subsequently. Crucially, the focus group discussions involved both the author of the image saying something about their intention, what they intended to convey, and other members of the group responding to the image with their own kind of interpretative reading of what the image said to them. 5 key themes in Supervisible in Scotland. First of all, you can analyse this data, the photographs as data, by looking at what is in the frame, literally in the frame, and the kind of sub-bullet points in black here are telling you what is in the frame. The blue bullet points are kind of implied readings of what metaphorically those objects were trying to say. And the generation of the themes in blue comes from not just me, in fact, not primarily me, but rather from the participants themselves. So this is, the blue comes out of their account of what they were trying to convey or what they took from one another's pictures. So some of the pictures are about development or change, some really interesting uses of scaffolding as a metaphor for a life rebuilding project. Sometimes they just took pictures of the places where they were helped and literally described them as resources for help. There were lots of bridges, roads and paths, which were all invoking the ideas of developmental journeys, I suppose, or change processes. There were images of watches, clocks, shadows and park benches that seemed to be saying something about time, often about time lost or time wasted or time suspended. There were lots of images of locks, chains, doors, gates, walls, dogs on leads, CCTV cameras, people or objects suspended that spoke to constraint in some way. There were lots of images of waste of the forms listed there. And there were a significant number of images of signs and words, proscriptions and prescriptions, road markings, road signs, and advertisements. So those were the five metaphorical themes as I read them from the interpretations of the participants. And I'll give you just a few examples. So here, Bob Hope um, takes this image, and this is what he says about it in terms of his intention. This is my first picture. It's a padlocked fence. It's just kind of spoke to me because you're kind of chained to the supervision order whether you like it or not. The second one, which I'm not showing you because of issues of anonymity and confidentiality, is the monument in front of the building where the supervision agency is based. And what it says to me is it's kind of ironic that you've got a monument of war and freedom right next to a building that you're going to be chained to, and there's bugger all you can do about it for the next however long. So this is essentially an image of constraint and control. Similarly, but interestingly different, The Long Walk by Messiah 10, that's his caption. My first picture is just a picture of the beach, going up to the beach right there, a woman walking her dog. For me, it kind of relates prison and probation and stuff, whereas it's the kind of relationship is one's the boss and one's the obedient one, the dog. It depends how you're treated. The dog looked happy on a walk, obviously treated well. That's the first one. So you could write a whole article on that picture and on that quote almost. My reactions to that. Well, first of all, it's fascinating that prison and probation and stuff are elided into almost a collective experience of penal control, where the formal distinctions between different kinds of sanction matter less than the subjective sense of being a controlled object. And the object-subject relation, the boss and the compliant one, the obedient one, the dog, the dehumanization implied in that self-identification with the animal, which the group murmur their assent to, so that something powerful about that itself. But then this qualification, which is kind of pathetic in the literal sense of the word, full of pathos, it depends on how you're treated. The dog looked happy on a walk, obviously treated well. That's the first one. So there's this qualification that the experience of constraint and control can be better or worse, depending on the sort of disposition of the supervisor. So a kind of a fascinating image on many levels, I think. Equally, this one, which appears in the Punishment and Society article, Elvis says the wee tree in the cage is sort of being restricted as to where it can go without a cage, kind of obstacle around it. So it's still got the walls, but it's not got its freedom. It's confined within its areas because it's restricted in that. If you look at that other tree behind it, there's nothing around that. That's a free tree. Do you know what I mean? That's going where it's meant to go. So what's fascinating about this is that the cage around the sapling or whatever it is, looks like a rhododendron bush actually in the front. That's meant to be a protective device. And other members of this group interpreted this as a positive image about growth being supported by protection. But for Elvis, who took this picture, it's the opposite. The tree is crooked because of the effort to protect. So again, there's so many layers of meaning and interpretation that are possible here. Summarizing the project more broadly, I'm realizing that I've talked for far too long, so I'll try and wrap this up quite quickly. These are pictures of complexity and ambiguity, neither inherently and inescapably negative, nor inherently and inescapably positive. I think, to me, they suggest that supervision is always, maybe, painful and sometimes, maybe, productive. So to paraphrase that common misreporting of supervisory sentences in the British press, people do not walk free from court when such sentences are imposed. Rather, they walk away under judgment, under constraint, under threat, and into a situation where the time is no longer their own. they enter a liminal position as half citizens, liberty preserved, but autonomy and status significantly compromised. In Seen and Heard, we took some of these images, you can see in the pictures here, into songwriting workshops with professional musicians, supervisors, a few others, including me. The process involves unplugged performances of songs written in previous workshops, then using the visual stimuli, and then going through a set of songwriting activities and exercises, then co-writing and recording the songs, and having a kind of playback at the end where we all hear what everybody else has done. I worked with 2 people in the context of that workshop, having been asked to kind of pretend to be a musician because of oversubscribed, too many people in the workshop. So I kind of stepped into the musician role, and then helped TJ write Blankface, and then helped John write Helping Hand. And I've just given you the lyrics here. I asked you to listen to this in advance. I don't know if you'll have had the chance, but the link's there and you can follow up later. Again, this song is important in the development of the analysis in the Punishment and Society paper, because the song and the conversations with TJ around it helped me to understand the extent to which, for him, supervision was more an experience of degradation than an experience of discipline. And I kind of developed that point in the article. And the article's pretty bleak about the maloptical qualities of supervision. And then, of course, I went back to the second project, the second co-write with John, where John writes out a much more positive song about his experience of supervision, and how, in fact, looking back to the time when he got into trouble, he wished that he'd had supervision, and now he's glad that he's got it. And yes, he would like to move beyond it, taking the lessons of it with him. And yet there's ambivalence in the chorus here. Hold my hand and let me go. Things I know I can't unknow. Let me go, please hold my hand. It's time to fly. I know I can. So he's expressing confidence in his ability to live post parole. He's on parole, but he's not resentful of the situation that he's in. He doesn't feel degraded by it. And I think there are several reasons why John and TJ's experiences are different. And I've written about those in the chapter. I'll say a little bit about them here. The idea of the malopticon is just that rather than thinking about a dispersal of discipline in the classic Stan Cohen riffing off Foucault style, I made up the word malopticon to think about the dispersal of degradation through certain kinds of institutionalized forms of punishment linked to supervision. So that here, ironically, you're not rendered super or hyper visible. It's not that the thing sees you well or looks intently into you. It's rather that it sees you badly. It misrecognizes and objectifies you. It adds a layer of kind of moral condemnation and stigmatization to that misrecognition. And then, to make matters worse, it misrepresents and projects that misrecognition, sort of reifying your degraded status through its risk and protective practices and projecting them out into the world. There's more about this in the paper and in the chapter. So here I'm arguing that the experience of misrecognition in the malopticon is a dispersal of control, maybe sometimes through discipline, sometimes through distortion of who you are, certainly of how you see yourself, always through degradation, because supervision entails a degradation of your civic status and your legal rights, and sometimes to disqualification. So sometimes the object of the degradation seems to be to disqualify you. You can think of lots of examples of this, particularly in the American context. But disqualification can be enduring in many jurisdictions, or it can be temporary. And this is important because I think one of the key differences between John and TJ is that John doesn't experience supervision as maloptical, certainly not to the same extent as TJ, because he thinks it's legitimate. He does see himself as being given a second chance, that he is still earning. He committed a very serious crime. He went to prison. He did his time, and he sees supervision as part of his time, a legitimate and appropriate part of his time. The fact that his supervisor is helpful, and helpful in the sense of helping him be and become who he recognizes himself to be. That's a good person, not an offender. That adds to the recognizing as opposed to the misrecognizing quality of this experience. And thirdly, for him, not for TJ, there's a temporality in play. So John's supervision will end. It's something he's going through, but TJ is stuck in it forever. He's a life licensee, and he'll have that status until he dies. And for him, that's the problem. He has no way beyond the misrecognition that the system imposes on him. All of which, to me, implies the need for three things. And this is what I think will probably go in the final chapter in a much developed and hopefully more clearly articulated version. But I think there are three kind of main imperatives, prescriptive imperatives that come out of the analysis. One is that we need to think about parsimony and to scale down mass supervision and mass penal control. Secondly, we need to clarify and circumscribe its legitimate purposes, and that links to questions of proportionality. And thirdly, we need to think about whether it can be designed, constructed, and practiced in ways which are productive rather than destructive, recognizing rather than misrecognizing. So that's about finding ways to deliver supervision with legitimacy, helpfulness, and with constructive support. Getting there, having some kind of public dialogue, some sort of progressive democratic discussion about mass supervision is not going to be easy, certainly not in Trump's America or in Brexit Britain. But one of the reasons why I'm so sold on storytelling and pictures and songwriting is that they have the capacity to bring more a more vivid quality to our imagination of what these experiences are. And I think that if we can't conjure up in our minds the thing that we're trying to debate and discuss, then we're in trouble. And I think cultural representations, in fact, countercultural representations that help to constitute a creative dialogue are part of what we need to do in public or civic criminology. Okay, I'm going to stop. I went on for far too long. I apologize profoundly. You've probably all gone off and done more interesting things. So I'll stop this. I'll go back to the bit where I can see comments. I'll keep talking for a while hopefully you start typing in some questions if you're still there. So yeah, I'm going to escape the screen sharing. Switch that off. Shut that down. There's me. Now there's something I need to do to find where the chat is. That Sarah kindly showed me a few days ago, which I've forgotten. I'm going to try and look it up. Oh, here I am. Okay, I'm waiting for live chat to be reconnected. That's probably because, yeah, it's because my laptop has defaulted to the really annoying University Flexi Access system, which doesn't work. So I'm now going onto the right internet server. And that should give me live chat now. Yay, great. Okay, so I can now see, yeah, okay, Nicole. We've got Nicole, you wanted to know where the paper is. So it's Actually, in the PowerPoint presentation right near the beginning, I included a link to it. So let me just find the link. I know that I'm not screen sharing, so you can't see this, but I can see it. So yeah, it's Punishment in Society. I'm not sure if it's out yet. I think it's still on the advanced access. Online first is what it's called. And it's called Mass Supervision, Misrecognition, and the Malopticon. So you can find it there. Okay. So it was daylight savings time that caused the confusion on the time difference. So hey, there you go. There's no daylight left here. I can tell you that. Um, So actually, in the supervisable project, was there a difference between parolees and probationers? For example, were parolees more likely to capture forms of constraint in their pictures? This was really interesting because we were looking for variation according to form of supervision, and I think that in the specific small focus group where TJ just say this, TJ and Elvis are the same person, but he chose different pseudonyms in the pictures and in the song project. So in the photo project, he's called Elvis. I think in the Punishment in Society paper where I'm discussing his pictures and his song, I just call him TJ all the way through for simplicity. But in the discussion of Elvis's pictures by the others in the group, they were both people on community payback order, so that's like Scottish probation. And they tended towards more positive readings of his images than he intended. But looking across England, Germany, and Scotland, there were the commonality across the respondents, in spite of the range of forms of supervision. So, for example, a significant number of the German respondents came from a halfway house, so they were parolees in a semi-free context, right in the kind of no person's land between imprisonment and community. In fact, that was a large part of the German site. In England, the principal site was a community justice centre for women subject to supervision, and I think probably all of them were on probation or what's called a community order or a suspended sentence order in England. And yet, looking across the three countries and the diverse forms of supervision, there was no obvious pattern differentiating those on post-release parole and those on probation type measures. So, although the study was too small to seek to overgeneralize that, my sense is that if you did it at larger scale, you would find some patterns of variation. But nonetheless, that those kind of headline sort of qualities of constraint, waste, judgment is the word that we use to describe one of the key features across the three sites. I didn't use it in the Scottish site, in reporting on the Scottish site tonight, but time, constraint, waste, judgment, and growth were the five themes across the three sites. And it was striking how well those themes encompassed the range of different forms of supervision in play. So less difference than I would have expected, but I think we would need to do a bigger study to be clearer about that. Okay, so that was Ashley's question. Nice comment from Ashley. Nice comment from Nicole. I'll just keep talking while I wait to see if there are any more questions. I realise that I've spoken for so long that you probably all have to go and do other things now. Okay. So Ashley, can you say more about the reasons for thinking of penal supervision as distinct from mass incarceration rather than as subsuming mass incarceration? Well, you absolutely could use the term supervision in that way, and that's exactly what I tended to discover, that North American scholars do use supervision in that way to span the whole correctional system. But I mean, maybe it's just an intercontinental difference. In the UK and in Europe, we deliberately use supervision to make a distinction. We would often talk of community supervision, and maybe that makes it more explicit what we mean. So there's no kind of right or wrong answer with respect to that. But what I'm trying to do is to draw out this thing, mass probation and mass parole, mass supervision in my use of the term, and to draw particular attention to it within the context of a wider concern around mass penal control. What I want to fight against, if I'm honest, is the privileging of the prison and the jail in the way that we think about punishment. Because I think that means that we're not looking properly at the thing that we're trying to explain, unless people want to be very explicit about that being their sole interest. But I think the prison dominates our academic imaginations and public imagination in relation to punishment in ways which are profoundly problematic for how we think about penal systems. Okay, Heather, is there currently a discussion in Scotland about reducing imprisonment? Oh yes. Does it provide an opportunity to make it more visible? Yes. So this is an interesting story and one that I tell in the book, because my chapter on legitimation and adaptation is essentially an extended case study of the history of probation / criminal justice social work in Scotland. That's a history of successful failure, as I call it. So from inception in the late Victorian era to the present day, the principal narrative for supervision in Scotland has been reductionist. It began in Glasgow, where I am tonight, with a local councillor trying to do something about the huge number of Glaswegians who were being sent to prison for fine default at the turn of the 20th century. And he incepted a police probation scheme, which was distinctive and interesting for a variety of reasons. Roll forward 105 years, 103 years, in 2008, we have Henry McLeish, a former First Minister, kind of Prime Minister of Scotland in the post-devolution era, leading an independent prisons commission, which was actually a sentencing commission, arguing for the displacement of prison from the kind of default to the margin in our response to offending in court. And it's in the context of that report and the reforms that it promoted that we now have something called the Community Payback Order in Scotland, and that we are legislating now a presumption against short sentences, so that judges will be expected not to pass prison sentences of less than a year, they're expected to prefer community sentences. I call it a history of successful failure because, and this will be no surprise to Michelle, we've massively expanded supervision. In fact, in chapter 3, I show that our growth in the probation rate in Scotland has been even faster than the growth in the United States. So we grew from about 3,000 people, tiny number, in 1980 to about 23,000 people by 2010. So it's a 7-fold. I'm not obviously a quantitative social scientist, but a huge increase. But the prison population continued to rise until very recently, and now it looks as if the McLeish reforms are beginning to exercise some effect on the prison population in Scotland, but still a very small effect. So there's a lot of reform effort gone into boosting and expanding community sanctions, which I think has been partly misdirected. I talk about this in chapter 3 again, drawing on Michelle's work, that if you want probation to divert, then you have to be very careful about its targeting, and you have to be very careful about the way that it's constructed in its practices, particularly in relation to the way that it deals with compliance. And we do pretty well on how we construct the practice and manage the compliance, but we haven't done so well on how we target the sanction until recently. So I think there are improvements, and there's a story to tell in Scotland. Okay, so Nicole, there's a great methods piece by Cesria Rumpf on using participant-elicited interviews as a method. She had a lot of problems with her IRB. Yeah, I bet she did. Take pictures of other people, or right. So we got our project through the equivalent of IRBs by prescribing that people could not take pictures that identified themselves or any other person. So it wasn't that pictures couldn't include images of people, but they couldn't be identifiable. And actually, Jenny was brilliant at this. She worked in both workshops to give people ideas about how they might include themselves or others in the images, but in subtle ways. So one of my favourite images, the one, in fact, with which I started tonight on the title slide, is a non-identifiable image of a man hanging from a children's climbing frame. There's another one that I use in the Punishment Society paper of shadows cast on the ground from a children's climbing frame. So the people are in the picture, but they're not identifiable. And we just compromised that was the only way that we could get ethical approval. And our participants were happy to run with that. So a straightforward answer. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm waiting for 2 of 2 from Ashley now on this question about probation as punishment. Yeah, an ongoing issue in the field as to the boundaries of what constitutes punishment. Absolutely. So I've written about this a little bit before. The persistence of the idea that probation and parole represent acts of clemency or mercy or largesse, generosity towards an by definition unworthy subject. And there's great work in the philosophy of punishment on mercy. We had a debate about it in Scotland, as you can possibly imagine, after the release of the Lockerbie bomber a few years ago, with fascinating contributions by Anthony Duff, whose work you might know, and by Lindsay Farmer. And what I got into reading about mercy at that time a little bit, and one of the things that really stuck with me is the idea that by definition, mercy cannot be earned. Nobody can be entitled to mercy, and nobody can have a right to mercy. Rather, the whole point of mercy is that the state or the sovereign is entitled to execute the just punishment in terms of proportionality, and that it chooses not to. And at the inception of probation, I think this is true possibly in North America, certainly true in Scotland and England. What happened was that instead of sentencing at all, the judge said, I'm going to put you on probation. So you have a year or 6 months or 2 years to prove yourself. And I know you know this history, so I don't know why I'm telling you it. What happened in Scotland was that if you came back at the end of that period without being in trouble and having complied with the conditions, you didn't even get a conviction until the law was changed in the 1990s. So for 90 odd years of the history of probation in Scotland, it was explicitly instead of punishment, instead of sentencing. And so it's not surprising that the kind of remodeling of the community payback order as a form of punishment, indeed the default form of punishment in the Scottish system, according to the McLeish report that I mentioned a minute ago. It's not surprising that that's taken a while to bed in. It's still the case. I have a PhD researcher I work with here in Glasgow called Javier Valenzuela Velasquez, and he is a Chilean prosecutor by background who's studying these reforms, the introduction of the community payback order, but also more fundamentally trying to understand the culture and practice of Scottish judges. And his evidence from observations in court, from interviews with Scottish judges, and to a certain extent from analysing sentencing patterns, is that they are still, most of them, treating supervisory sanctions, community payback orders, as an act of generosity intended to address the welfare needs of the offender so as to reduce the risk of further offending. So it's kind of a mixture of, it's a classic post-war welfareism still enduring in the Scottish context. It's dressed up a little bit more around risk, and social workers are more preoccupied, perhaps even than judges, with risk in Scotland now, partly because of the sorts of case that I mentioned earlier with Stephen Leask. But yeah, centrally there's a stubborn persistence in the belief that to be given probation or parole is to be done a favour, and that nobody is entitled to probation or parole. And for me, that's fundamentally problematic. People then assume that the recipient of this act of mercy is benefiting from it and should be happy about it. Indeed, that it would be a kind of egregious case of bad manners to express any negative experiences that are pursuant to being granted such an unmerited gift. So there's a fundamental problem in the way that we debate probation and parole. I think that has its historical roots in this construction of these as undeserved, unmerited. They're not within the bounds of justice. That's the whole point. They are acts of mercy. Therefore, I can make no claim to be entitled, and I can make no case about the way that I'm treated during that measure, because I'm lucky to have it. Essentially, I think that sums up the kind of place of supervision still in the judicial, and to the extent that it exists at all in the public imagination, I suspect that's how it would be constructed. Okay. How does that thinking extend to life sentences following capital punishment commutation? Well, we don't have capital punishment. We don't have life without parole either at the moment, but we do have, as in the case of TJ, life sentences, which are life sentences. And he stays subject to supervision for the rest of his days. I'm not sure this is what you're getting at, Ashley, but I mentioned in the Punishment and Society paper, it took me about a year after speaking to TJ to figure out what he was saying to me. I just couldn't compute. And the thing I couldn't compute was that I know that legally he has the right to have the requirement to see a social worker removed. So in a sense, he can remove himself from the discipline of supervision. But he said to me, and it took me a year to read it in the transcripts and to figure out what I couldn't comprehend about it. He basically said to me, "What's the point in that?" And my head was so locked into the idea that it was the being supervised that was punishing and difficult and disciplining and painful and exercising its pervasive effects on him, that it was only after kind of studying what he'd said and what he'd written in blankface and what he depicts in his pictures that I came to understand that what he was saying was, no, the problem here is that you think I need to be supervised. So his degradation is perennial, indefinite. And that's the thing that he finds the most difficult about his life sentence. Yeah, I see your point now. If people think of mercy as a favour, then what is it to be commuted and to serve, um, well, indeed to serve a life sentence inside rather than to be executed? Or in a sense, I suppose you could see release from a life sentence in the UK context as a sort of commutation to parole. Um, Personally, I would want a system where we would think of parole decision making as uh, balancing or engaging with two issues. One is um, public safety, public protection, and the appropriate management of risk. The other is the right to reintegration. And I'm a big fan of Dirk Van Smith's work on life without parole, and his admittedly very European sort of reading of life without parole as normatively problematic because of what he conceives of as the human right to hope. Um, and so I think when a punishment, in the Scottish system, when you get a life sentence, the judge declares the punishment part, and that's the period before which parole can't even be considered. After that period is served, then parole can be considered and release may come if the parole board deems that risks can be safely managed. But the parole board doesn't consider a right to reintegration, and I think it should, because I accept Dirk's arguments about the human right to hope, and because I'm sort of disposed to, and I suppose both evidentially and to a certain extent normatively committed to ideas of rehabilitation. I realise that I'm now starting to waffle, which is probably a product of fatigue and hunger. But anyway, Ashley asks a minute ago if there are any other questions, and I think I might have talked you all into submission. I'll wait a moment or two before getting up. Okay, great. I think that means that we're done. So please do follow the link that Ashley sent around and have a listen to the songs on the Seen and Heard EP. Blank Faces there, but there are others, and I'd love to get your feedback on those and any kind of thoughts that they spark about representing and experiencing supervision. Hi, Phil. Thank you for your thank yous. And hello, Rose, and goodbye. But yeah, I'll take it we're done and I shall sign it off. It's nice to talk intercontinentally. It's a shame that it's a one-way conversation. So I'd love to get a chance to talk again sometime, and next time I'll be on the end of the live chat asking you tricky questions. So thanks for tuning in. I'll just say good night and or good afternoon, I guess it'll be for you guys. So I hope to see you soon. I will be in Chicago and Minneapolis and New York in the week beginning the 12th or 13th of April, doing some talks at the University of Minnesota, so University of Chicago, University of Minnesota, and at John Jay College. So if any of you happen to be in those towns around that time, give me a shout and maybe we could go for coffee and have a proper conversation with more than one voice in it. Okay, I'll say farewell for now and hope to catch up with you soon. Bye.